In the fading light of a world where Rome's once mighty eagles no longer cast their shadows across Britain's shores, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The year was 410 AD, and as the last Roman legions marched away from these mist-shrouded islands, they left behind not merely empty fortresses and crumbling roads, but a void that would reshape the very soul of a nation. From this chaos would rise one of history's most remarkable transformations, a saga of conquest and faith, of kings and peasants, of soaring cathedrals and doomed knights riding into legend. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me guide you through the sweeping story of medieval England, a journey that spans nearly 1,000 years of human ambition, divine belief, and relentless change. This is not merely the tale of dates and battles, though both will appear in abundance. It is the story of how a scattered land of warring tribes became a kingdom, how that kingdom survived the fury of Viking longships, how it was conquered by Norman knights and gradually transformed into something unprecedented in human history. The threads of this story stretch from the smoke-darkened halls of Saxon warriors to the graceful arches of Gothic cathedrals. From monks bent over manuscripts in candlelit solitude to the thunderous charge of cavalry at Hastings, we will witness the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth of parliaments, the flowering of literature, and the endless dance between crown and church that defined medieval life. But before we can understand the majesty of what was to come, we must first look into the darkness from which it arose. The Roman withdrawal left Britain fractured, exposed, and yearning for leadership. Into this void stepped peoples whose names still echo in our language and landscape, warriors whose descendants would one day rule an empire upon which the sun never set. The Saxon shore, as the Romans had named the eastern coastline, lay open to the grey waters of the North Sea. Beyond that horizon, where storms gathered like omens, restless tribes were preparing for journeys that would alter history forever. The Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, driven by population pressures, climate shifts, and the eternal human hunger for better lands, turned their gaze toward the fertile valleys and defensible hills of post-Roman Britain. What followed was not a single invasion, but a centuries-long migration, a slow, unstoppable transformation of the British world. The newcomers came not as one grand army, but as countless warbands, each following its own lord, each seeking its own destiny. They brought their gods, their laws, their languages, and their dreams of kingdoms that might endure for generations. The Romano-British, who had lived under imperial rule for nearly 4 centuries, now faced a choice that would shape the next 1,000 years. Some fled westward into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the flickering flame of Roman civilization and Christian faith. Others stayed, adapting to new rulers and new customs. Still others fought desperate battles to preserve what they could of the old world. It was in this age of turmoil that the figure we know as Arthur may have emerged. Not the shining knight of later legend, but perhaps a war leader striving to unite the remnants of Britain against the advancing Saxon tide. Whether Arthur was a single man or the echo of many, his legend endures as a symbol of courage in the face of chaos, of light flickering in the encroaching dark. The Saxon kingdoms that eventually arose from this chaos were unlike anything Britain had known before. Gone were the marble halls and bureaucratic order of Rome. In their place stood personal kingdoms, built upon bonds of loyalty between lord and warrior, protector and protected. A king was no distant ruler, but a fighter who proved his worth in battle, rewarded his men with gold and land, and embodied the virtues his people revered. In the timber halls of these early realms, warriors gathered around roaring fires as shadows danced on carved beams. There, the scop, the court poet, sang of heroes and monsters, of triumph and doom. Their language, the ancestor of our own, was rich with rhythm and alliteration, capturing both the clash of battle and the quiet ache of human longing. When they told of Beowulf's fight against the monster Grendel, they were not merely entertaining, they were defining heroism itself. Their religion reflected their world, fierce, fatalistic, and deeply human. They worshipped gods whose names still mark our days. Tu, the god of war, Woden the wanderer, Thunor, the bringer of thunder, and Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility. These gods were not distant or perfect, but faced struggles and destiny like the mortals who worshipped them. Even they, it was said, would one day fall when the world ended in fire and frost. Yet, even as these pagan kingdoms took root, another faith was preparing to transform them completely. In the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, Christian monks preserved not only the Gospels, but much of the wisdom of the ancient world. They nurtured a distinct form of Christianity, one of scholarship, devotion, and missionary zeal. And soon, these Celtic monks began their journey southward, carrying a message that would change England forever. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was not a swift replacement of one faith by another, it was a slow, intricate weaving of old and new. When missionaries like Columba and Aidan reached Northumbria, they found not savages but sophisticated societies with law, poetry, and craftsmanship. Their task was not to erase but to transform, to present Christianity in ways that resonated with existing ideals while elevating them towards something higher. King Edwin of Northumbria, one of the first great rulers to accept Christianity, famously compared human life to a sparrow flying through a warm hall on a winter night. The bird enters from the dark, enjoys a moment of light and warmth, and then disappears again into the cold. Christianity, he suggested, offered hope that beyond that darkness lay something more, that death was not the end. In that single metaphor lies the heart of the Anglo-Saxon transformation. Their old worldview was not hopeless, but realistic. Every hall would burn, every warrior fall, every treasure fade. To live with honor, to be remembered in song, to face fate bravely, that was their creed. Christianity did not destroy this ideal, but fulfilled it, offering a promise beyond the grave. Conversion came slowly, unevenly. Some rulers were moved by faith, others by politics, still others by love or counsel. The result was a patchwork of beliefs that took generations to unify. A turning point came at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, where leaders of the Celtic and Roman churches debated how English Christianity should be practiced. They argued over what might seem trivial, the date of Easter, the style of tonsure, but beneath these questions lay deeper struggles about authority, unity, and identity. In the end, England chose to align with Rome, a decision that bound it more closely to continental Europe and helped shape its destiny. From this moment, English monasteries blossomed into centres of learning and art. The monasteries of Northumbria, like Wearmouth and Jarrow, became beacons of scholarship rivaling any in Christendom. There, masterpieces like the Lindisfarne Gospels were created, radiant with intricate patterns and devotion. And it was in Jarrow that the Venerable Bede wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a work that not only chronicled a conversion, but helped forge a national identity from a patchwork of warring tribes. The monasteries were more than sanctuaries of prayer, they were engines of civilization. They farmed vast lands, educated the young, advised rulers, healed the sick, and preserved the written word. As the 8th century dawned, Anglo-Saxon England stood as a synthesis of warrior courage and Christian intellect. The kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent flourished with art, trade, and governance. English monks were preaching the gospel abroad. English scholars were shaping the Carolingian Renaissance. It was a golden age born from centuries of struggle. But even golden ages end. Across the cold northern seas, in the fjords of Norway and the islands of Denmark, a new power stirred. And soon, The dragon-prowed ships of the Vikings would appear on England's horizon. They too were warriors, but they served different gods and lived by a code all their own. They had mastered the art of shipbuilding, crafting vessels that could slice through open oceans yet glide effortlessly up shallow rivers. They had forged a culture that celebrated personal glory, where courage stood as the highest virtue, and where raiding was not seen as barbarism, but as a noble path to wealth, power, and eternal fame. The first warning of their coming storm appeared on June 8, 793 AD, when dragon-prowed ships emerged ghost-like from the morning mist off the coast of Northumbria. Their target was not a fortress nor a royal hall, but something far more shocking, the holy island of Lindisfarne, the beating heart of Northumbrian Christianity. The assault was swift, merciless, and unlike anything the Anglo-Saxon world had ever seen. The Vikings, as they would come to be known, were not mindless savages driven by chaos. They were methodical and deliberate predators who understood exactly what they were doing. They knew that monasteries were treasure houses, filled with gold and silver, but guarded only by unarmed monks. They knew that by desecrating holy ground, they would not only plunder wealth, but strike terror into the soul of a Christian people. The massacre at Lindisfarne sent shockwaves across the land. Soon, the raiders returned again and again, their ships slicing through the surf like blades. They struck monasteries, villages, and trading towns with blinding speed, appearing without warning, overwhelming defenses, seizing captives and plunder, then vanishing back to sea before any organized resistance could form. Their shallow draft ships carried them inland through winding rivers, spreading fear to places that had never imagined the sea could bring death. As the 9th century advanced, the nature of these Viking incursions began to change. What had begun as seasonal raiding soon became permanent occupation. In 865, the so-called Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. It was no longer a band of raiders, but a massive force of conquest. Led by figures who would become legend, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and their kin, the army swept across England, crushing kingdoms, dismantling old power structures, and tearing apart the fragile political balance that had held since Rome's departure. The English response was scattered and desperate. Some kings, like Edmund of East Anglia, chose martyrdom rather than submission. Others fled or bent the knee to their new overlords. But in Wessex, the last unconquered English kingdom, a different spirit took shape under a young leader destined to be called Alfred the Great. Alfred's greatness was not only in the battles he fought, but in the vision that guided him. He understood that the Viking threat could not be defeated by swords alone. It demanded something deeper, a rebuilding of the English spirit, the strengthening of its institutions, and the creation of a united people bound by faith, law, and common cause. The story of how he achieved this transformation marks one of the most remarkable chapters in all of English history. Alfred of Wessex was born into a kingdom scarred by war and chaos. When he became king in 871, he inherited not just a crown, but a nation on the brink of annihilation. The once great monasteries that had served as centers of faith and learning lay in ashes. The libraries that had preserved the wisdom of centuries were scattered or burned. Everywhere, the shadow of Viking steel loomed. Yet Alfred possessed something no enemy could destroy, a vision beyond mere survival. He saw that the Vikings were not merely plunderers, but a test of England's very soul. Their strength lay not only in their arms, but in exploiting the divisions of a fractured land. To overcome them, Alfred would need to forge something entirely new, an England united in purpose and identity. That test came sooner than anyone could have imagined. In the bitter winter of 878, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating the feast of the 12th night. The assault was devastating. The king barely escaped with his life, retreating into the marshes of Somerset with only a handful of loyal men. For weeks, the fate of England hung by a thread. Its king was a fugitive, its lands in ruin. Yet from that darkness, Alfred began to rebuild. Using secret messengers and beacon fires, he sent word across Wessex. The king still lived, the fight was not over. The response was extraordinary. From farms, villages, and ruined halls, men came forth, not by command, but by conviction. They came because they believed in something greater than fear. In May of that same year, at Edington, they stood together. The Battle of Edington was more than a victory. It was a rebirth. Outnumbered and outmatched, Alfred's army fought with the desperation of those defending home and faith. When the Viking shield wall finally shattered, it was not only an army that broke, but the illusion of Viking invincibility. A wave of hope swept across the land, but Alfred's true brilliance shone after the battle. Rather than seeking vengeance, he sought wisdom. He met with Guthrum and forged the Treaty of Wedmore, a pact that divided England between the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes, but more importantly baptized Guthrum into Christianity, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. This was no mere peace treaty, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy and symbolism. By converting his greatest foe, Alfred transformed war into reconciliation, setting the stage for the gradual blending of two peoples. The region under Viking control, known as the Danelaw, retained its independence for a time, but over generations. Its people absorbed English customs, faith, and law, just as the English learned from their former enemies, adopting their trade networks, craftsmanship, and maritime skill. Alfred's reforms extended far beyond politics or war. He saw that England's true survival depended on the restoration of knowledge. The destruction of monasteries had nearly extinguished literacy and learning, so Alfred made it his mission to rebuild the mind of his nation. He personally translated major works from Latin into English, founded schools for the sons of nobles, and encouraged the use of the native tongue in writing and record-keeping. His crowning cultural achievement was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a monumental work that told, in plain English, the story of the people themselves. It was more than a history book. It was the birth of English identity. For the first time, men could read their nation's story not in Latin, but in their own voice. Alfred's reforms reached even into law and governance. His Doom Book, a unified legal code, drew from the traditions of all the English kingdoms and infused them with Christian ideals of justice, mercy, and redemption. He believed that law should reflect morality, that punishment should fit not only the crime, but the intent, and that the weak must be shielded from the power of the strong. In warfare, too, Alfred reshaped the future. He replaced the outdated levy system with a rotating army that could fight while others tended their farms, ensuring the realm remained both productive and defended. He built fortified towns, burhs, throughout the kingdom, strongholds that served as both defensive bulwarks and thriving communities. Within their walls, markets flourished, craftsmen worked, and trade revived. These burhs became seeds of future cities, centers of commerce, governance, and unity. The legacy of Alfred's vision endured long after his death. His successors, Edward the Elder and Aethelstan, carried forward his mission, reclaiming lands from the Danes and integrating them into a single English realm. Under Aethelstan's rule, England became a truly united kingdom for the first time. His victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, where an alliance of Vikings, Scots, and Welsh was shattered, marked the final triumph of Alfred's dream. The chroniclers wrote of it as one of the bloodiest battles in English history, where, as they said, never yet in this island was a greater slaughter by the edge of the sword. From the ashes of invasion and despair, a nation had been forged. Through courage, wisdom, and faith, England had found its soul. But the victory was absolute, establishing Aethelstan as the first ruler who could rightfully claim dominion over all of England. The 10th century became a golden age of English identity, a time when Anglo-Saxon traditions, Christian learning, and Viking ingenuity blended to create a culture unlike any other in Europe. Monasteries rose again from ruins, this time larger and grander, symbols of faith and learning. Illuminated manuscripts reached artistic heights unseen before, their pages glowing with intricate designs and divine imagery. Masterpieces like the Benedictional of St. Ethelwald rivaled the finest works from continental Europe. Architecture too transformed, from humble wooden halls to majestic stone structures that reflected both craftsmanship and spiritual vision. The English Church during this era forged its own path, one that honored Roman authority yet held fast to native customs and traditions. English monks and scholars journeyed across Europe, carrying not only the word of Christ, but the intellectual heritage preserved in their monasteries. Their scholarship was so esteemed that foreign rulers eagerly invited English clerics to their courts to advise and teach. But perhaps the greatest transformation of all was not architectural or spiritual, it was psychological. England, once a patchwork of rival kingdoms, began to think of itself as one people, united by shared faith, shared struggle, and shared destiny. This growing sense of unity reached its height under Edgar the Peaceful, who reigned from 959 to 975. At his coronation in Bath in 973, kings from Scotland and princes from Wales gathered to recognize his supremacy. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of symbolism, blending divine sanction with royal authority, Edgar's crown becoming a sacred emblem of English unity under God. During this era, the English state developed an administrative sophistication far ahead of its time. The land was divided into shires, each overseen by a sheriff answerable directly to the king. Local courts resolved small disputes, while serious cases went before royal justices. Royal writs, formal commands bearing the king's seal, allowed orders to travel swiftly and effectively throughout the realm. The prosperity of late Anglo-Saxon England shone in its growing towns and flourishing trade. London had emerged as one of Northern Europe's great commercial centres, linking merchants from Ireland to Russia. English silver coins circulated from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, a symbol of economic might and political stability. Yet beneath this success lay hidden fractures. England's unity, while its greatest strength, made it an irresistible prize for foreign powers. The Danish kings, descendants of the same Vikings once fought off by Alfred, now ruled a strong, organized kingdom across the sea and looked upon England with ambition. The storm broke under King Ethelred, known as the Unready, a name that reflected not cowardice but poor counsel. The new Viking invasions that began in the 980s were unlike the earlier raids. These were not hit-and-run plunders. They were invasions of conquest, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. The invaders came better armed, better led, and more determined. England's response revealed how time had eroded Alfred's once great system. Years of warfare had drained the treasury, weakened defences, and sapped the spirit of the people. When Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark landed his armies, he faced a realm that had lost its will to resist. The conquest of England by the Danish kings, Sweyn, and later Cnut, marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon era, though not of English civilization. The new rulers, understanding the strength of the institutions they inherited, preserved much of the English legal and administrative order. Cnut's reign from 1016 to 1035 proved that effective kingship could transcend bloodlines, that England's political structure was resilient enough to endure foreign rule. But his empire was built on personal power rather than enduring foundations. When his successors failed to maintain that strength, the way opened for the restoration of the old English dynasty. When Edward the Confessor ascended the throne in 1042, many hoped for a return to the golden peace of Edgar and Athelstan. But the England he ruled was no longer the same. Years of Danish rule had changed the nation's fabric. New elites had risen, earls who governed vast regions like independent princes, the Church had drawn closer to the continent, bringing reformist ideals and tighter bonds with Rome. England itself had become part of a wider European system of politics and trade, stretching from Norway to Normandy. It was clear that isolation was over forever. The next chapter of English history would be written by those who could navigate the storms of a changing Europe. Across the Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy, one such storm was gathering strength. The Norman Duke who would one day reshape England was born into chaos and violence. William, the Bastard, as his enemies called him, was the illegitimate son of a duke, raised amid assassinations and rebellion. He learned early that survival required both ruthlessness and vision. By the time he reached manhood, he had turned Normandy into one of Europe's most formidable military states. The Normans were a hybrid people, descendants of Viking settlers who had embraced Frankish customs with zeal. They built a society rooted in feudal loyalty, where every warrior owed his lord not just allegiance but armed service. Their cavalry, clad in chainmail and wielding long lances, revolutionized warfare. They fought with precision, coordination, and cunning, masters of the feigned retreat and disciplined charge. Their churches and monasteries became beacons of reform and learning, tightly bound to Rome's authority. In Normandy, the sword and the cross walked hand in hand. This fusion of military might and spiritual legitimacy would soon change the course of history. When Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, England faced a crisis of succession. Powerful nobles, foreign claimants, and old alliances collided in a struggle that would decide the fate of the realm. The mighty Godwin family dominated English politics. Earl Godwin of Wessex and his son Harold commanded vast wealth, private armies, and the loyalty of much of the south. Edward's marriage to Godwin's daughter, Edith, had produced no heir, leaving the royal line without a clear successor. Several candidates emerged. Young Edgar the Etheling had royal blood but no real influence. Harold Godwinson, though not of royal birth, was the kingdom's strongest leader in both war and governance. And then there was William of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had once promised him the crown, and that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to uphold this promise during a visit to Normandy in 1064. Whether that oath was freely given or forced remains uncertain. But the Normans would use it as divine justification for conquest. When Edward died, the English council chose Harold as king. That single act set into motion one of the most dramatic years in all of English history. In 1066, England faced not one invasion but three. From the north came Harold's own brother Tostig, allied with the fearsome Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a giant of a man who had fought from Byzantium to Jerusalem and was considered Europe's greatest warrior. His claim to the English throne was weak, but his ambition was boundless. In September 1066, his fleet of 300 ships appeared in the Humber estuary. The battle for England's soul was about to begin. The army that landed on English soil was vast by medieval standards. 15,000 hardened warriors, veterans of countless battles, come not to raid, but to conquer. Their first strike was devastating. At the Battle of Fulford, they annihilated the forces of the northern earls, killing Earl Waltheof and capturing much of Yorkshire's nobility. It was a brutal reminder that the Viking spirit, though aged, still carried fire and ferocity. Harold's reaction was immediate and decisive, revealing the organizational mastery and military brilliance that had made him the strongest man in England. Within days of hearing of the invasion, he had assembled his forces and was marching north at a pace that stunned contemporaries. His speed caught the Norwegians utterly unprepared. When Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, Hardrada's men were scattered across the countryside, many without armor. Convinced there was no threat for miles, the battle that followed became legend. King Harald Hardrada, the Thunder of the North, fought with desperate valor, his fate sealed, yet his spirit unbroken. As the sagas tell, an arrow pierced his throat as he urged his warriors into one final doomed charge. The slaughter was near total. Only 24 of the original 300 ships were needed to carry the survivors home. The Viking age of conquest ended that day, silenced by English swords. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Harold's army, though victorious, was exhausted, battered, and stretched thin. Even as they buried their dead in the north, a greater danger was already gathering across the Channel. Norman sails were being unfurled. William's knights were mounting their horses, and the invasion that would alter the course of English history was about to begin. William's preparations had been painstaking, ruthless, and deliberate. For months, he had forged alliances, secured papal blessing, and assembled the greatest invasion force Northern Europe had seen since Rome's legions. His army was not purely Norman, it was a coalition of warriors from across France, bound together by promises of English gold and land. Above them flew the papal banner, the symbol of divine sanction. Pope Alexander II had declared Harold a usurper and oathbreaker, turning William's invasion into a holy crusade rather than an act of ambition. It was a masterstroke of politics. The Church's support gave William legitimacy and drew allies who might otherwise have hesitated. On September 27, 1066, nearly 700 ships left Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. They carried not only men and weapons, but horses, armor, siege equipment, and months of supplies. The voyage across the Channel was a triumph of seamanship, the entire fleet landing safely on the Sussex coast near Pevensey. There, William built a fortified camp and established his foothold in enemy territory. His choice of landing site was brilliant, right in Harold's own heartland. It was a personal challenge as much as a military one. By striking at the core of Harold's power, William forced him into a corner. The psychological blow was immense. Harold had no choice but to abandon his victory celebrations and march his weary army south once more. For 2 tense weeks, the two forces maneuvered across southern England in a deadly game of speed and deception. Harold, despite his exhaustion, moved swiftly, determined to replicate his triumph at Stamford Bridge, attack suddenly, force battle before the enemy was fully prepared, and crush them with the momentum of surprise. But William of Normandy was not Harold Hardrada. He was calculating, cautious, and utterly without mercy. He understood that time was his greatest enemy. If he failed to bring Harold into battle quickly, reinforcements would swarm from across England, and his fragile position would collapse. Both men knew the stakes. The future of kingdoms rested on their next decisions. When dawn broke on October 14, 1066, the two armies met at Senlac Hill near Hastings. It was a meeting of two worlds. Harold's army, stout English infantry wielding axes, spears, and swords, stood shoulder to shoulder behind their great shield wall, a formation that had served their ancestors for generations. They held the high ground, their ranks unbroken, their cries echoing through the morning mist. Below them waited William's host, the most formidable military machine in medieval Europe. His cavalry, armored and disciplined, fought as one living weapon. His archers loosed storms of arrows that darkened the sky, and his combined tactics, archers, infantry, and horsemen working in perfect coordination, were unlike anything England had ever faced. The clash was apocalyptic. Wave after wave of Norman knights charged the English line, only to be cut down by the wall of steel and fury. Axes split helmets, horses fell screaming, and the ground ran red with blood. For hours, neither side yielded. Then, as the sun sank westward, a rumor spread that William had been killed. Panic rippled through the Norman ranks. But the Duke, unscathed, tore off his helmet and rode before his men, shouting his name, rallying them to fight on. Then came his masterstroke, the feigned retreat. Pretending to flee in terror, the Normans drew parts of the English line forward, breaking their formation. At that moment the cavalry wheeled around, surrounding and cutting them down. Harold fell beneath a hail of arrows and swords, fighting to his last breath beside his banner. With his death, Anglo-Saxon England died too. The field of Hastings was littered with the bodies of England's nobility, the last generation of men who had ruled since Alfred's time. Their blood soaked the Sussex soil, marking the birth of a new order. The psychological shock was immense. The English had not only lost their king, but the very foundation of their world. The earls were dead, the old church humbled, and the people left leaderless beneath the shadow of a foreign crown. William's march toward London after Hastings was an exhibition of cold, calculated terror. He did not attack the city directly. Instead, he advanced through the southern shires, burning villages and seizing towns, spreading fear like wildfire. The message was unmistakable. Resistance meant annihilation. Submission was the only path to survival. By the time William reached the Thames, the English nobles came forward to submit. The old order had ended and a new one, born of iron and fire, had begun on Christmas Day, 1066. William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony, performed by English bishops but witnessed by Norman lords, symbolized a fragile fusion of two civilizations. Yet even as the crown touched his head, riots broke out in the streets outside. It was a sign of things to come. Conquest was only the beginning. The realm William had won was far from united. It was a patchwork of resentful nobles and frightened peasants, all bound together by fear rather than loyalty. The surviving Anglo-Saxon lords submitted in name but ruled their regions as they pleased, waiting for weakness to strike back. The church, though outwardly obedient, clung to its traditions and resisted Norman interference. And the common people, weary and impoverished, saw their new masters as foreign tyrants. William's true challenge had only begun: to turn conquest into governance, fear into stability, and domination into legitimacy. In 1067, while he was in Normandy consolidating his continental holdings, rebellion exploded across England. The same lords who had bent the knee at Hastings now raised their banners once more. In the north, Edgar the Etheling, last heir of the royal line, returned from exile to claim his birthright. These uprisings were not blind acts of vengeance. They were coordinated, strategic, and aimed at exploiting the fragile nature of Norman control. The conqueror, who had taken a kingdom with one battle, now faced the far more perilous task of keeping it. If they could isolate these garrisons, crush them one by one, and block Norman reinforcements from crossing the Channel, they might just drive the invaders back to their ships. William's reaction to this crisis revealed exactly why he had become master of Normandy despite his illegitimate birth. He returned to England with astonishing speed, bringing fresh troops and a fierce determination that bordered on the fanatical. But this time, his methods had changed. The generous victor of Hastings was gone, replaced by a ruler who had learned that mercy could be mistaken for weakness, and that lasting peace might demand a reign of terror. What followed was a campaign unlike anything England had seen since the age of the Danes. William's armies swept through the rebellious territories with chilling precision, not merely defeating opposition, but annihilating the very roots of defiance. Villages were torched, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered. The Norman knights, men bred from childhood for war, proved equally efficient at the darker art of suppression. They left behind a landscape so ruined that chroniclers later wrote of regions where no smoke rose from a hearth for generations. The climax came in the bitter winter of 1069, when the last great uprising erupted in Yorkshire. The northern earls, supported by a Danish fleet in the Humber, seemed ready to relive the victories of their Viking forefathers. For a moment it appeared the Norman conquest might collapse entirely, that William would meet the same fate as other invaders who had underestimated England's endurance. But the king's response surpassed even his own previous ruthlessness. The harrying of the North, as it came to be known, was nothing short of apocalyptic. For months, his troops methodically destroyed everything that could sustain human life. Mills were shattered, bridges torn down, salt scattered across fields to poison the earth. Thousands fled southward, carrying only what they could. Behind them lay silence, a silence that would haunt the north for generations. The psychological shock of this devastation spread like wildfire. Refugees, hollow-eyed and starving, carried tales of terror throughout the realm. The message was unmistakable. William would rather rule over ashes than tolerate rebellion. The great uprisings that had once threatened to undo the Norman conquest were extinguished, not by grand battles, but by fear and cold calculation. The surviving nobles realized that continued resistance meant nothing but annihilation. Yet even as he demonstrated his terrifying resolve, William was building something far greater, a system of rule that would permanently reshape England. The feudal order he established was more than a military arrangement. It was a complete redesign of political and social life. Every acre of land now belonged, directly or indirectly, to the king. From the poorest peasant to the highest earl, all were bound by chains of obligation that reached upward to the crown. The Domesday Book, that monumental survey begun in 1085, revealed the scale of his transformation. For the first time, an entire kingdom was measured and recorded with near scientific precision. Surveyors moved from manor to manor, documenting livestock, mills, ploughlands, forests and fisheries, compiling not just a tax record, but the anatomy of a new kind of state. The Norman nobility that arose from this system bore little resemblance to the old Anglo-Saxon warrior elite. They were not bound by ancient bloodlines or tribal loyalty, but by land grants and royal favor. Their power flowed from property and administration, not heritage. Their castles, looming across the countryside, were not only fortresses but centers of governance, symbols of a new order that fused might with bureaucracy. Castle building became the architectural language of Norman authority. From the quick-built wooden motte and bailey forts to the towering stone keeps that took years to complete, each structure proclaimed the permanence of conquest. The White Tower in London, begun under William himself, stood as the ultimate statement of domination, its imported stone walls rising nearly 100 feet above the Thames, part fortress, part palace, part treasury, part prison. It was power made visible, a monument to control that would outlast its builders. The church, too, was transformed beyond recognition. Under Archbishop Lanfranc of Bec, a scholar and reformer, the English church was reorganized along continental lines. Monasteries were reformed, cathedral schools expanded, and clerics educated in both theology and statecraft. Massive stone cathedrals replaced the humble wooden churches of old, their ribbed vaults and pointed arches pioneering a new architectural era. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, embodied this Norman vision, its soaring columns and sculpted stonework lifting eyes and spirits heavenward while glorifying Norman power on earth. Language itself changed under Norman rule. A French-speaking aristocracy now ruled a people who spoke English, while Latin remained the tongue of record and learning. For centuries, England became a trilingual nation. From this fusion would emerge the English we know today, rooted in Germanic structure but enriched by French vocabulary. Literature reflected this cultural blend. The chansons de geste, heroic tales of Charlemagne's knights, echoed through the halls of Norman lords, while English monks continued to chronicle events in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, often with a mix of reluctant respect and quiet defiance. The legal system, too, underwent radical transformation. The localized Anglo-Saxon courts gave way to a centralized system of royal justice. The king's judges traveled the realm, enforcing uniform law that transcended regional custom. Out of this would grow the common law, the foundation of English legal tradition and one of its greatest contributions to civilization. Economically, England began to flourish under Norman efficiency. Systematic land use, improved farming methods, and new trade networks spurred growth. English wool became Europe's most prized commodity, fueling prosperity that would eventually make England a commercial power. William's invitation to Jewish financiers, barred elsewhere from Christian money lending, further strengthened royal finances and credit systems vital to expansion. But beneath the surface, deep divisions endured. The gap between Norman rulers and English subjects never fully closed. The peasants bore crushing burdens under feudal obligations, keeping alive memories of freedom that would one day spark rebellion. William's death in 1087 exposed both the strength and fragility of his creation. His sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry, fought bitterly over the inheritance, proving that no system, however advanced, could erase the human hunger for power. William Rufus, who seized the throne through cunning and speed, ruled with greed and cynicism, treating the church as a source of revenue rather than faith. His corruption and arrogance embodied the darker side of Norman rule. When William Rufus died suddenly in 1100, whether by accident or assassination, his brother Henry ascended the throne. Henry had spent his youth studying governance, not war. He understood that true power must rest not on the sword alone, but on stable institutions. His Charter of Liberties, issued at the start of his reign, was more than a political promise. It was the seed of constitutional government. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in England's story, one born from conquest but maturing into civilization. And as Henry's reign dawned, the world began to see that the marriage of Norman discipline and English tradition could give rise to something greater than either had been alone. The crusading movement that had captured the imagination of European nobility was opening new avenues for both martial glory and spiritual redemption. The intellectual renaissance transforming European thought was generating fresh ideas about governance, law, and the complex relationship between rulers and their subjects. Most crucially, the political framework established by Henry was poised to face the test of succession, as heirs with vastly different temperaments and priorities would determine whether the Angevin legacy could endure the transition from one generation to the next. The story of that transition and the dramatic events it unleashed represents the next chapter in our journey through the shadows of medieval history. As we trace the evolution of English civilization from its Norman roots toward the constitutional developments that would ultimately redefine the bond between crown and subject. Henry II's death in 1189 marked the end of an epoch. Few contemporaries could have grasped the full magnitude of the moment, as the king who had transformed England from a fractured, war-torn kingdom into the administrative heart of a sprawling empire passed away at Chinon Castle, abandoned by his sons and burdened by the fear that his achievements might not survive him. His final words, reportedly cursing the day of his birth, reflected a tragedy that went far beyond personal failure. They revealed the impossible weight of medieval kingship, a world where the fate of nations rested on the character and competence of a single man. The son who inherited this complex legacy embodied everything his father was not. Where Henry II had been careful, calculating, and methodical, Richard was impulsive, romantic, and driven by visions of glory that belonged more to the pages of chivalric romance than the harsh realities of medieval rule. Fluent in French, raised mostly in Aquitaine, Richard regarded England not as a homeland to protect, but as a treasury to fund his adventures abroad. His obsession with the Holy Land and the reclamation of Jerusalem from Saladin's forces marked a fundamental shift in the priorities of European nobility. The crusading movement, begun nearly a century earlier with Urban II's call to arms at Clermont, had evolved from spontaneous religious fervor into a sophisticated international enterprise that combined piety with politics. The Third Crusade, which Richard would lead alongside Philip Augustus of France and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, represented the apex of this evolution. The preparations for this vast expedition consumed the first 2 years of Richard's reign, revealing both the wealth generated by Henry II's administrative reforms and the fragility of the system that produced it. The Saladin tithe, an unprecedented levy on all movable property to finance the crusade, demonstrated the Norman administrative machine's ability to mobilize resources from English society. Yet the resentment it provoked, the economic strain it caused, and the opportunities it created for corruption exposed the limits of even the most efficient medieval government. Richard's regency arrangements, before departing for the Holy Land, reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of the political landscape his father had spent decades mastering by dividing power between Chancellor William Longchamp and half-brother Geoffrey. Richard established a system that invited conflict rather than ensuring stability. The civil war that erupted in his absence, though brief, underscored the enduring truth that a king's personal authority remained the cornerstone of medieval governance, no matter how sophisticated the administration. Reports from the crusade revealed Richard's military genius while exposing the futility of his grand designs. The siege of Acre, where Christian and Muslim armies clashed in a prolonged, deadly standoff, showcased medieval warfare at its most brutal and advanced. Richard's tactics, his use of siege engines, and his diplomatic dealings with Saladin demonstrated that the art of war had evolved far beyond the crude confrontations of earlier centuries. Yet despite his brilliance, Richard's crusade yielded nothing lasting. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, Crusader holdings were vulnerable to reconquest, and the enormous cost of the expedition drained Western Europe's treasuries without strategic gain. The king who had dreamed of emulating the heroes of romance found himself trapped in a struggle where courage and honor mattered less than logistics and finance. Richard's capture by Leopold of Austria on his return journey transformed him into a symbol of suffering across his domains. The ransom demanded for his release, equivalent to twice England's annual revenue, required innovations in taxation with profound consequences for the evolution of English governance. Raising the necessary funds could not rely on traditional feudal obligations alone, but required consultation with social groups never before systematically involved in royal policy. Negotiations preceding the collection of Richard's ransom marked the beginning of a new relationship between crown and subject, laying the groundwork for parliamentary governance. Assemblies convened to approve extraordinary taxes, representatives summoned to London to speak for their communities, and debates over the limits of royal authority established precedents that would influence future monarchs. When Richard returned in 1194, England was subtly but significantly changed. The administrative system had demonstrated its capacity to function without direct royal supervision, yet also revealed its susceptibility to corruption and abuse. Barons who governed in the king's absence had learned to wield power independently. The common people discovered that their consent was sometimes necessary for royal policy. Above all, the financial strain from the crusade and the ransom created a crisis of royal authority that would trouble Richard's successors for generations. The final years of Richard's reign were dominated by warfare with Philip Augustus of France, reflecting the altered priorities of European politics since the Norman conquest. Where William the Conqueror had invaded England to claim a throne, Richard and Philip waged war over territories and titles with a cynicism that would have shocked their predecessors. Warfare had become an end in itself, divorced from the religious and feudal obligations that once gave meaning to conflict. Richard's death at the siege of Chaluz in 1199, felled by a crossbow bolt while attacking a minor castle for reasons still unclear, seemed to epitomize the futility of his reign. Hailed as the greatest warrior of his age, he died pursuing a trivial quarrel with no bearing on the kingdom's larger interests. His act of forgiveness toward his killer, seen as noble by contemporaries, could not disguise a reign that achieved little and resolved nothing. The accession of John to the English throne marked the beginning of one of medieval England's most controversial reigns. The youngest son of Henry II had long lived in the shadow of his brothers, earning the nickname Lackland, as suitable territories for him were scarce. His reputation for treachery, established during Richard's crusade, preceded him and coloured every action he took. John's early reign was consumed by the struggle to preserve the Angevin Empire against Philip Augustus's increasingly aggressive attacks. The loss of Normandy in 1204, the catastrophic blow that cost England its ancestral homeland, shattered the Anglo-Norman nobility's confidence and forced them to choose between their English and continental estates. Resentments from this choice would poison John's relationship with his barons for years. The financial crisis from losing Normandy's revenue forced John to innovate taxation, bringing him into conflict with all segments of English society. Harsh enforcement of forest laws, strict interpretation of feudal obligations, and manipulative judicial practices all reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the delicate balance between royal authority and subject consent his predecessors had maintained. John's dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury escalated into a conflict that reshaped church-state relations across Europe. The papal interdict on England, forbidding Mass and sacraments, created a spiritual crisis affecting all levels of society. John's excommunication in 1209 provided his enemies a potent weapon to justify rebellion and resistance. The personal opposition John faced during his later reign was unprecedented. Led by figures like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, this movement combined grievances over taxation and legal abuses with theoretical arguments about the limits of royal power, drawing on English custom and continental law. The barons confronting John at Runnymede in 1215 were not merely defending privileges, they articulated principles of governance that would influence centuries of political thought. The Magna Carta, sealed on June 15, 1215, represented a revolutionary moment in medieval governance. Its 63 clauses, hammered out through weeks of negotiation between king and barons, established principles that would evolve into the constitutional foundations of English liberty. The famous clause guaranteeing that no free man could be imprisoned except by lawful judgment or the law of the land laid the groundwork for broader protection under the crown. Yet its immediate effect plunged England into civil war. John repudiated the charter within months, supported by Pope Innocent III, proving that even solemn agreements could not resolve the tensions between royal authority and baronial resistance. The barons' invitation to Louis of France to invade demonstrated the collapse of the political consensus sustaining the Angevin Empire. Civil war in John's final years reflected the decay of feudal bonds. The siege of Rochester Castle, where baronial forces resisted royal artillery for weeks, symbolized the fierce commitment of both sides to their visions of governance. The devastation to the countryside, foreign mercenaries ravaging lands, and the breakdown of law and order revealed the immense cost of political failure. John's death at Newark in October 1216, allegedly from dysentery but possibly poison, came when his cause seemed hopeless. The king who had begun his reign, controlling territories from Scotland to the Pyrenees, died ruling little more than Western England. His 9-year-old son Henry inherited a desperate situation and seemed unlikely to succeed where his father had failed. Yet the regency established for Henry III, led by papal legate Guala and veteran administrator William Marshal, displayed remarkable skill in restoring royal authority. The reissue of Magna Carta in modified form, the negotiated peace with French invaders, and reconciliation with the barons demonstrated that English institutions were resilient beyond the failures of individual kings. The Battle of Lincoln in 1217, where the octogenarian William Marshal led royal forces to victory against baronial rebels and French allies, marked England's recovery from a crisis that had nearly destroyed the monarchy. The elderly knight, who had served 4 kings with unwavering loyalty, proved that the ideals of feudal service could still inspire extraordinary achievement. His tactical and moral leadership preserved the Plantagenet dynasty and safeguarded the political innovations that would transform England. Henry III's minority, lasting until 1227, allowed institutions time to recover from John's reign. The slow restoration of royal authority, careful diplomacy with continental powers, and healing from civil war's scars demonstrated the resilience of the political system the Normans had built and the Angevins refined. As Henry III approached adulthood, preparing to assume personal control, England was profoundly changed from the kingdom his great-grandfather Henry II had ruled. The loss of continental lands forced the nobility to identify more closely with the island. Financial pressures from constant warfare had created new forms of political consultation that would evolve into parliamentary government. Legal innovations from the Angevin period had established a common law system that transcended local customs. The crown's administrative machinery had proven capable of functioning even without effective royal leadership. The stage was set for the next chapter in English constitutional development, as a new generation of kings and nobles would confront enduring questions about royal authority, the rights of subjects, and the proper relationship between crown and community, issues that would shape the trajectory of English civilization for centuries to come. The story of how these questions were answered and the dramatic events that followed awaits us as we continue our journey through the mists of medieval history. The young king who came of age in 1227 inherited a realm shaped by crisis into a form his predecessors could scarcely have imagined. Henry III's England was no longer the continental empire stretching from the Cheviot Hills to the Pyrenees, but an island kingdom compelled to define its own identity within the boundaries of the sea. This transformation was not a loss, but a concentration of focus that channeled English energies inward, fostering innovations in government law and culture that would eventually leave an enduring mark on the medieval world. Henry III's personal rule began with promise, but quickly revealed contradictions that would define his long and troubled reign. The king possessed genuine piety, refined taste in the arts, and a sincere concern for his subjects' welfare, yet he lacked the practical political acumen required for effective medieval kingship. His love of grandeur led him to embark on architectural projects rivaling those of the greatest continental monarchs, while his generosity toward foreign relatives and favorites created resentments that would strain relations with the English nobility for decades. The rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, Henry's greatest architectural achievement, exemplified both his vision and his limitations. The soaring Gothic arches, intricate stone tracery, and jewel-like stained glass transformed the ancient Saxon church into a monument worthy of European admiration, reflecting the cultural sophistication English civilization had achieved. Yet the enormous cost of this project, financed through taxation that weighed heavily on an already burdened population, revealed the king's inability to reconcile aesthetic ambition with political reality. The provisions of Oxford, imposed on Henry by his barons in 1258, represented a revolutionary effort to limit royal authority through institutional reform rather than personal restraint. A council of 15 nobles was empowered to oversee royal policy. The king was required to consult with his subjects before making major decisions, and regular assemblies were established to review government actions. Together, these measures created a framework for constitutional monarchy that was centuries ahead of its time, yet they also exposed the tension between effective governance and popular oversight, a tension that would haunt English politics for generations. The civil war that erupted when Henry attempted to overturn the provisions brought to prominence one of medieval England's most remarkable figures. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a French nobleman who had married into the royal family, gradually became a champion of English constitutional rights. His transformation from royal favourite to revolutionary leader mirrored broader societal changes, as men who had once defined themselves through personal loyalty to the crown began articulating notions of national identity and popular sovereignty. The Battle of Lewes in 1264, where de Montfort's forces defeated the royal army and captured both Henry III and his son Edward, marked the temporary triumph of constitutional principles over royal absolutism. The Parliament summoned by de Montfort in 1265, which included not only nobles and clergy, but also representatives from towns and shires, established precedents that would evolve into the House of Commons. For the first time, the voice of common people was heard in government councils, creating a political revolution whose effects would reach far beyond the medieval period. Yet de Montfort's victory was brief and ultimately tragic. The Earl, who had fought to constrain royal power, found himself wielding authority hardly less absolute than the kings he opposed. His reliance on foreign mercenaries, manipulation of popular assemblies, and growing isolation from moderate opinion highlighted the difficulty of translating constitutional theory into practical governance. His death at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, where he was overwhelmed by Prince Edward's forces, ended the first great experiment in parliamentary government. The restoration of royal authority after Evesham was carried out with moderation, reflecting lessons learned from decades of civil conflict. The dictum of Kenilworth, which set the terms for reconciliation with rebels, demonstrated that both sides had grasped the futility of pursuing absolute victory. Henry, humbled by rebellion, showed mercy to former enemies, while the barons accepted the restoration of traditional monarchy in exchange for guarantees of customary rights. The reign of Edward I, who succeeded his father in 1272, began a new chapter in English history. A king trained in the arts of war during his youth brought military skill, administrative competence, and political vision to the throne, transforming England into one of Europe's formidable powers. His conquest of Wales, intervention in Scotland, legal reforms, and development of parliamentary institutions set patterns of governance that would endure for centuries. The Welsh wars of Edward's early reign were more than military campaigns. They were exercises in cultural transformation, reshaping the Celtic periphery of the British Isles. The castles Edward built, from Caernarfon to Conwy, were not mere fortifications but symbols of English power designed to awe the Welsh and underscore the permanence of their subjugation. The English laws and officials he imposed gradually eroded traditional Celtic customs, embedding English authority in the conquered territories. The Scottish wars that dominated Edward's later reign proved far more challenging than his Welsh campaigns. Alexander III's death in 1286 and the ensuing succession crisis promised a smooth extension of Edward's authority, yet Scottish resistance, symbolised by William Wallace and later Robert Bruce, revealed the difference between conquest and governance. The battles of Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn became enduring symbols of Scottish independence and the limits of English power. Edward's legal innovations, reflected in statutes bearing his name, systematically codified and rationalised common law. The Statute of Westminster, Statute of Mortmain, and others addressed legal and property issues, cumulatively creating a coherent system of jurisprudence that would influence the English-speaking world for centuries. Edward, known as the English Justinian, left a legal legacy more enduring than his military achievements. The development of parliamentary institutions under Edward reflected practical governance needs rather than ideological commitment to popular rule. Assemblies summoned to approve taxation, hear petitions, and witness important ceremonies gradually became a regular part of governance. The model parliament of 1295, carefully balancing nobles, clergy, and commons, established a template for representative government copied across Europe. Financial pressures drove Edward to seek parliamentary approval for policies, reflecting broader societal changes. The king, once largely self-financing, now governed a nation where administration, warfare, and diplomacy far exceeded traditional revenue. Taxes granted by Parliament, loans from Italian bankers, and commercial duties collected from merchants demonstrated England's integration into a European economy operating under new rules. The expulsion of Jews from England in 1290 marked both the end of an era in economic development and the manifestation of religious and racial tensions reshaping Europe. Jewish communities, crucial in finance since the Norman conquest, fell victim to prejudice and royal greed. Their departure forced the development of alternative credit systems and investment methods, contributing to the commercial revolution that would make England one of Europe's wealthiest nations. Cultural achievements under Edward reflected growing sophistication and continental integration. Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and emerging vernacular literature demonstrated that England had become a major centre of medieval culture. Legal treatises, historical chronicles by Matthew Paris, and architectural innovations such as Westminster Abbey contributed to a cultural flowering rivaling that of France or Germany. Edward I's death in 1307 marked the end of an era of expansion and the beginning of a period testing whether his institutions could endure a transition to new leadership. His son, Edward II, inherited none of his father's military skill or political acumen, yet faced challenges demanding capable rule. Scottish wars that seemed nearly won dragged on, financial strains returned, and constitutional issues resurfaced. Edward II's reign would expose both the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental system developed over the previous century. The institutional framework designed for strong kingship faltered under weak leadership, while parliamentary traditions evolved to limit royal authority were tested by the demands of effective governance. The early 14th century tragedies would reveal the fragility of medieval political arrangements and the immense cost of constitutional failure. The story of that tragedy and the remarkable recovery that followed represents the next chapter in England's epic medieval history. Foundations had been laid, institutions established and precedents set, yet the greatest tests awaited future generations, tasked with inheriting both the achievements and the problems of their ancestors. The young king who ascended in 1307 seemed destined to undo his father's accomplishments. Edward II possessed neither the martial prowess that had conquered Wales nor the political instincts that had transformed parliamentary assemblies into instruments of royal policy. Where Edward I had led from the front, Edward II pursued refined tastes and intimate friendships, shocking a nobility accustomed to martial virtues. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, the Gascon knight companion since childhood, became the defining issue of his early reign. The extraordinary honours bestowed upon Gaveston, his influence over policy, and the king's contempt for established nobility created a crisis far beyond personal jealousy. Barons, accustomed to working within constitutional frameworks, confronted a king intent on ruling through personal whim. The ordinances of 1311 imposed on Edward, as the provisions of Oxford had been on his grandfather, sought to curb royal authority through institutional means. A commission of 21 lords was empowered to reform the royal household. The king required baronial approval for key appointments, and Gaveston was explicitly demanded to be exiled. The nobility had learned to articulate grievances legally and institutionally rather than through armed rebellion. Yet Edward II's tragedy lay not in defying baronial demands, but in his inability to provide the leadership the kingdom desperately needed. Scottish wars, once nearly won under Edward I, collapsed into humiliating defeats, restoring Scottish independence and shattering English military prestige. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert Bruce annihilated the largest English army assembled, marked not just military disaster but psychological trauma for generations. Financial crises forced Edward to summon Parliament with unprecedented frequency, giving the Commons unprecedented authority. Shires and borough representatives who had once approved taxation began petitioning for redress and asserting that their consent was required for significant government action. The constitutional revolution, begun under Henry III and shaped under Edward II, accelerated beyond any individual's control. The rise of Thomas of Lancaster as de facto ruler during Edward's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of baronial governance. The king's cousin, controlling vast northern territories and commanding loyalty from many nobles, possessed the power to challenge royal authority directly. Yet Lancaster's rule proved as arbitrary and ineffective as Edward's had been, demonstrating that the difficulties of medieval government extended far beyond the character of individual rulers. The murder of Piers Gaveston in 1312, carried out by a faction grown impatient with constitutional restraints, marked a decisive turning point in English political culture. The brutal execution of the king's favourite, seized under safe conduct and killed without trial, revealed the fragility of the rule of law and the power of personal vengeance to override institutional procedure. The trauma inflicted upon Edward II transformed him from a weak, yet essentially harmless ruler into a man consumed by the desire for revenge. Civil war erupted when Edward finally moved against Lancaster and his allies, exposing the complete breakdown of consensus that had once united the English nobility. The Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322, where Lancaster's forces were defeated and the Earl himself captured and executed, marked the temporary triumph of royal authority. But Edward's victory came through methods that violated every principle of justice and due process established by English law, setting precedents that would eventually imperil the monarchy itself. The rise of Hugh Despenser the Younger as Edward's new favourite showed that the king had learned nothing from the Gaveston affair. The Despensers' rapacious greed, their disregard for established legal procedures, and the violence they used against enemies recreated the conditions of the earlier crisis. Unlike Gaveston, Hugh Despenser possessed both the administrative skill and ruthless ambition necessary to convert favouritism into systematic tyranny. The invasion of England by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer in 1326 was more than a rebellion against an unpopular king. It was a revolutionary moment that reshaped the relationship between crown and subject for centuries. The Queen, humiliated by her husband's open preference for male favourites and the exiled baron who had fled to France, assembled a coalition including disaffected nobles and representatives of merchants and commoners weary of incompetent governance. The rapid collapse of Edward II's regime revealed the king's total loss of popular support. Once commanding the resources of Europe's wealthiest kingdom, he found himself abandoned by servants, pursued by subjects, and reduced to a fugitive in his own realm. The capture of Edward and the Despensers at Neath Abbey in November 1326 ended one of England's most disastrous reigns, while raising enduring questions about royal authority. Edward II's deposition in 1327 required unprecedented constitutional innovations. The Parliament summoned to witness his abdication included not only nobles and clergy, but representatives from all social levels, forming an assembly claiming to speak for the entire English people. The articles of accusation read against the king the formal renunciation of allegiance and the recognition of his infant son as monarch established procedures referenced in later crises. The murder of Edward II at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, ordered by Mortimer and likely with Isabella's consent, demonstrated that even elaborate constitutional procedures could not eliminate the role of violence in medieval politics. The king's death, allegedly inflicted by a red-hot poker, was designed to leave no external marks while maximizing agony, symbolizing punishment for violating the natural order through unnatural relationships. The regency of Isabella and Mortimer, governing in Edward III's name, revealed that removing a tyrannical king did not guarantee competent governance. The Queen Mother and her lover proved as arbitrary as the Despensers, amassing wealth and power while neglecting desperately needed administrative reforms. Their rule showed that the problems of medieval government ran deeper than personal failings, reflecting tensions between effective administration and constitutional law. Edward III's coup in 1330, capturing Mortimer at Nottingham Castle and sending him to the scaffold, marked the beginning of England's most glorious medieval period. The young king, shaped by his father's chaotic reign and his mother's corrupt regency, possessed both the military genius and political wisdom to restore English power and prestige. His reign would witness the beginning of the 100 Years' War, a flowering of English culture and the development of parliamentary institutions that transformed European governance. The Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, where Edward III crushed a Scottish army and restored dominance over the northern kingdom, showed that his father's military failures were the result of incompetence, not structural weakness. Edward's innovative tactics, combining dismounted men-at-arms with archers, revolutionized European warfare and established England as the dominant military power of the 14th century. Edward's claim to the French throne in 1337 through his mother Isabella provided the pretext for a conflict defining English foreign policy for over a century. The war was not merely dynastic, but a struggle for control of Western Europe's economic and political systems. The English wool trade, Flemish textile industry, and French wine regions became battlegrounds reshaping the medieval world. The victory at Crécy in 1346, where Edward III's forces decimated French chivalry through mass archery, marked the beginning of English military supremacy. The death of the blind King John of Bohemia, tied to his horse to strike a final blow for honor, symbolized the passing of an age where individual heroism could outmatch tactical innovation. The Siege of Calais demonstrated Edward's understanding that lasting victory required strategic control. A year-long investment, starvation of the population, and surrender negotiations created a legend inspiring English patriotism for centuries. The establishment of an English garrison provided a permanent foothold on the continent and a base for future campaigns. The Black Death of 1348 represented a catastrophe, dwarfing any military or political crisis. Originating in Central Asia and spreading along trade routes, it killed perhaps a third of England's population, transforming society in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. Social and economic disruption challenged medieval assumptions and spurred innovations in government, law, and culture, accelerating England's transformation into a modern state. Labour shortages gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power, leading to wage increases and social mobility threatening feudal structures. The Statute of Labourers in 1351 attempted to freeze wages and social relations, but economic forces unleashed by the plague proved stronger, eventually fueling open rebellion. The renewal of the French War in the 1350s allowed Edward III to demonstrate that English military superiority had endured. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the Black Prince captured King John II of France and devastated the French nobility, confirmed that tactical innovations pioneered at Crécy remained effective. Ransom payments funded further campaigns and cultural projects proclaiming English power. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, granting sovereignty over Aquitaine and Calais in exchange for renouncing claims to the French throne, seemed to mark England's triumph. Yet peace proved more challenging than war. Veteran soldiers found themselves unemployed, and governing vast French territories tested administrative capabilities beyond military experience. The Good Parliament of 1376 demonstrated the shifted political balance. Emboldened by their role in financing French wars, the Commons asserted authority previously unthinkable, impeaching corrupt officials, demanding accounting of royal expenditures, and insisting on genuine consent for taxation, setting precedents, transforming English government. The deaths of the Black Prince in 1376 and Edward III in 1377 ended an age of military glory, beginning internal conflicts testing whether institutions from the previous century could endure. The child king, Richard II, inherited challenges that would test even the most experienced ruler, while barons discovered that lessons of the past offered imperfect guidance. The peasants. Revolt of 1381 reflected social tensions building since the Black Death. The poll tax triggering the uprising was the final straw for a peasantry long oppressed. Rebels led by Wat Tyler and John Ball demanded not only tax relief, but the abolition of serfdom, redistribution of wealth, and a more egalitarian society. The confrontation at Smithfield, where young Richard II faced rebels in person, demonstrated his courage and cunning. His promises to grant demands, apparent sympathy, and willingness to risk his safety created a legend inspiring future monarchs. Yet the brutal suppression of the revolt, execution of leaders, and restoration of the old order revealed that royal gestures could not overcome medieval social inequalities. Richard II's evolution from this promising beginning to his tragic conclusion represents the next chapter in medieval England's epic story. As we continue through the mists of time toward a new age, institutions had been tested, precedents established, foundations laid, but the greatest challenges still lay ahead, awaiting future generations inheriting both achievements and problems. Richard II, who inherited the throne in 1379, seemed destined to complete the constitutional revolution building for over a century. He possessed intelligence, education, and charisma absent in his immediate predecessors, yet he faced challenges testing not only his personal character, but the very foundations of English governance. The kingdom he inherited was no longer Edward III's feudal realm, but a complex society reshaped by new wealth, governance ideas, and expectations of royal authority. Richard's court reflected cultural flowering and growing English sophistication. Geoffrey Chaucer's poetry vividly portrayed life from knight to ploughman, showing the English language could express the full human experience. Elaborate court ceremonies, magnificent tournaments, and architectural innovations proclaimed England a major center of medieval civilization. Yet beneath the glitter, tensions built that would eventually destroy the king and the constitutional system he inherited. Financial pressures from warfare, social disruption from plague, and religious controversies sparked by reformers like John Wycliffe challenged centuries-old societal assumptions. Parliament evolved as a royal partner, increasingly asserted authority threatening monarchical supremacy. The Lords Appellant crisis of 1387–1388 revealed the shifted political balance. Magnates challenging Richard sought not to overthrow the monarchy but to control it through parliamentary procedures and legal precedents unimaginable to earlier generations. The merciless parliament that followed demonstrated that constitutional tools forged during prior crises could now constrain the crown, creating a political conflict transcending personal rivalries. Richard's response showed both political genius and a misunderstanding of society's transformation. Forced to witness friends executed and policies overturned, he spent the next decade carefully rebuilding authority, using legal precedents and parliamentary procedures to strengthen royal power while maintaining the appearance of constitutional government. His creation of a court party loyal to himself rather than to institutional traditions, his manipulation of legal procedures to eliminate opponents, and his gradual accumulation of unprecedented royal authority all showed that constitutional limits imposed by Parliament could be bypassed by a ruler skilled in political maneuvering. The tyranny Richard established in the final years of his reign was more dangerous than the crude desperation of earlier monarchs because it operated within the forms of constitutional government while violating its spirit. The court of chivalry he employed to circumvent common law procedures, the blank charters forced upon his subjects, and the coerced loans extracted without parliamentary consent all created a system of royal absolutism more sophisticated and oppressive than England had ever known. The Revolution of 1399, which brought Henry of Bolingbroke to the throne as Henry IV, represented more than a mere dynastic change. It was a constitutional crisis that reshaped the relationship between Crown and Parliament for centuries. The Duke of Lancaster's claim to the throne, based on a mix of hereditary right and parliamentary recognition, set precedents that transformed the nature of English kingship. Richard II's deposition, carried out through parliamentary procedures giving legal sanction to what was essentially a military coup, showed that even the most sacred aspects of royal authority were subject to popular consent. Henry IV's reign proved that winning a throne was easier than keeping it, particularly when its legitimacy remained in question. The new king faced practical challenges governing a kingdom exhausted by decades of war and internal strife. alongside the theoretical problem of justifying his authority to subjects who had sworn allegiance to his predecessor. Rebellions erupted throughout his reign, from the Welsh uprising of Owain Glyndwr to northern revolts, led by the Percy family, all fueled by the fundamental illegitimacy of Lancastrian rule. But the financial crisis plaguing Henry IV's government revealed how far the balance of power had shifted between crown and parliament. The king, who had seized the throne promising constitutional governance, found himself more dependent on parliamentary grants than any previous monarch. The commons, empowered by their role in legitimizing the new dynasty, began asserting authority over royal policy in ways unimaginable under the Plantagenets. The principle that taxation required parliamentary consent, established in earlier crises, evolved into the broader notion that Parliament must approve all major governmental actions. Henry V's accession in 1413 marked the start of medieval England's most glorious period, as the young king, trained in both war and governance, achieved feats rivaling those of Edward III. The renewal of the French War, justified by dormant claims, offered Henry the opportunity to unite a divided kingdom and demonstrate that English military superiority had endured the previous generation's constitutional upheavals. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where Henry's outnumbered forces vanquished a seemingly invincible French army, became a defining moment of English medieval culture. Victory achieved through tactical innovation, disciplined courage, and divine favor created a legend inspiring English patriots for centuries. The longbowmen who held firm against charging knights, the dismounted men-at-arms who fought with desperate valor, and the king himself sharing the dangers of his humblest soldiers, became symbols of English greatness that transcended immediate military outcomes. The conquest of Normandy following Agincourt showed Henry V possessed not only military genius, but the administrative skill to govern conquered territories. Systematic reduction of Norman strongholds, establishment of English garrisons, and creation of an administrative system extracting resources while maintaining local loyalty demonstrated England had learned from earlier continental campaigns. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, recognizing Henry as heir to the French throne, seemed to promise the realization of English ambitions long frustrated. Yet the completeness of Henry V's triumph contained the seeds of future disaster. The king, who had united England behind his French campaigns, died when his achievements seemed secure, leaving an infant son to inherit territories maintainable only through constant warfare. The Regency government for Henry VI faced the impossible task of governing two kingdoms with conflicting interests while managing a nobility accustomed to conquest profits and resistant to the limitations of peace. The gradual loss of French territories during Henry VI's minority revealed how dependent English success had been on the personal authority of individual kings. The Battle of Patay in 1429, where Joan of Arc's inspired leadership transformed French military capabilities, marked the start of a French recovery that would eventually expel the English from all continental possessions except Calais. The siege of Orléans, Charles VII's coronation at Reims, and the systematic reconquest of English strongholds demonstrated that the French had combined religious fervor with military innovation in ways the English could not match. Returning, English armies brought home not only defeated soldiers, but new ideas about governance, society, and the relationship between rulers and subjects. Veterans, once enriched by plunder and ransom, found themselves unemployed in a kingdom offering few opportunities. Nobles experienced in French campaigns discovered that military skill counted for little in English politics. Most dangerously, common soldiers who had seen their social superiors flee began questioning assumptions about hierarchy and authority that had governed society for centuries. Henry VI's mental illness from the 1450s created a crisis of authority that ultimately destroyed the Lancastrian dynasty. The king, raised to believe in the divine nature of his office, could not perform basic government functions, while regents lacked legitimacy to maintain order. Factional conflicts erupted as nobles vied for control of the helpless king. gradually escalating into civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of St. Albans in 1455, where the Duke of York's forces defeated the royal army and captured Henry VI, marked the start of 30 years of intermittent warfare transforming English society more profoundly than any foreign invasion. The conflict was more than dynastic. It was a struggle between competing visions of English governance as Yorkist and Lancastrian parties articulated differing theories of royal authority and subject rights. Henry VI's deposition in 1461 and Edward IV's coronation demonstrated that precedents from 1399's revolution could be repeated when circumstances demanded. The young Yorkist king, claiming the throne through military victory and hereditary right, represented a new generation understanding that successful monarchy required both traditional legitimacy and popular support. Edward IV's administrative reforms, commercial policies, and cultural patronage showed the monarchy adapting to late medieval realities. Henry VI's brief restoration in 1470 and second deposition in 1471 revealed how shattered old certainties about royal authority had become. The battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, where Edward IV's forces finally crushed Lancastrian resistance, marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of England's medieval period. The death of the last Lancastrian prince at Tewkesbury, Henry VI's murder in the Tower, and elimination of all potential claimants showed the Wars of the Roses had been fought with unparalleled ruthlessness. Edward IV's restoration in 1471 ushered in a new age in English history. The king, seasoned by civil war, understood lasting peace required not only military victory but reconstruction of damaged institutions. Expansion of royal authority, development of efficient administration, and new revenue sources showed the monarchy evolving into a more modern, powerful entity than its medieval predecessors. Edward V's brief reign in 1483 and mysterious disappearance in the Tower created the final crisis of the medieval period. Richard III's usurpation, justified by claims of illegitimacy of his predecessor's children, demonstrated that constitutional principles could still be manipulated by those understanding systemic weaknesses. The rebellion against Richard, Henry Tudor's invasion, and the Battle of Bosworth Field, where the last Plantagenet king died defending his crown, marked the end of the medieval era and the rise of the Tudor dynasty. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval history, the tapestry of events across nearly 1,000 years comes into focus. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerging from Roman Britain, the Norman conquest reshaping society, the Angevin Empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, constitutional developments limiting royal power, cultural flowering producing Chaucer and great cathedrals, military triumphs establishing England as a European power, and civil wars testing every institution, all contributed to a civilization destined to leave a global legacy. The England Henry VIII inherited in 1485 was no longer William the Conqueror's feudal kingdom or Henry II's personal domain, but a nation-state with sophisticated institutions, a distinctive cultural identity, and a sense of historical destiny driving future expansion. Parliament, evolved from medieval assemblies, would become the mother of global democratic institutions. Common law, emerging from Anglo-Saxon custom and Norman efficiency, would spread throughout the English-speaking world. The English language, shaped by Latin, French, and Germanic influences, would become a vehicle for literature read wherever humans sought to understand existence. Medieval England's story is how warring tribes became a unified nation, feudal relationships evolved into constitutional government, and local customs developed into universal principles of law and justice. It is a tale of remarkable individuals shaping history through courage, wisdom, and determination to build something better than what they inherited. It is also the story of ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers, who laid the foundations of modern civilization through labor and defense of institutions protecting their rights. As sleep carries you from these ancient shores, Remember, medieval England was not a distant realm of isolated knights and castles, but the foundation of our modern world. Our freedoms, laws, and governing institutions trace back to those misty centuries when England was young and the future was being written in the deeds of men and women whose names echo through history. In their struggles, triumphs, failures, and achievements, we see our own quest to create order from chaos, justice from oppression, and hope from despair. The medieval age ended, but its legacy endures, carried forward by generations, building on the foundations laid with courage and determination. The mists of time may obscure individual lives, but the great themes of aspiration and achievement that defined medieval England continue to inspire and guide us in facing our own challenges. Ultimately, the greatest gift of the medieval world is the knowledge that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when united by common purpose and sustained by unshakable faith in human progress.
Power begins where emotion dies. Most men aren't prisoners of systems, women, or enemies. They're prisoners of themselves. They flinch, they rage, they react, and in that instant, they lose control. They surrender their crown to the chaos around them. But not you. You're here to master the highest form of discipline, emotional control. You will learn to never react, only respond, to turn your emotions into a weapon, cold, precise, and deadly. This isn't about denying your humanity. It's about refining it into power. Because the calm man is the most terrifying force alive. When you move with quiet calculation, you become untouchable. Comment below, "I am my own weapon." Say it, write it, remember it, because today you stop being emotional and start becoming dangerous. Number 1, the power of silence and restraint. Silence is the native language of strength. The weak fill the world with noise, excuses, and explanations, desperate for validation. The powerful understand that silence is power. When you stay quiet, you own interpretation. You let others project their fears, desires, and insecurities onto your stillness. That is psychological warfare, the Machiavellian way. Every reaction exposes you. Every restraint conceals you. The man who doesn't rush to respond terrifies everyone because he cannot be read or predicted. In a world that worships attention seekers, your restraint becomes rebellion. People fear what they cannot define. And silence makes you undefined, a mystery no one can solve. When you master silence, you gain leverage in every interaction. Speak only when your words are strategy, never emotion. That is how kings speak. That is how predators hunt. Remember this, your silence is not weakness. It's control disguised as calm. Comment below, "My silence speaks louder than emotion." Let them wonder what's on your mind while you're already 3 moves ahead. Your power begins the moment you choose restraint over reaction. The quiet man always wins because the loud man has already exposed himself. Silence doesn't beg to be heard. It commands respect. Number 2, mastering the emotional battlefield. The mind is a war zone, and emotions are landmines designed to destroy you from within. Most men walk through life stepping on their own traps. Anger, jealousy, fear, detonating every time someone presses the right button. That's not power. That's slavery. To dominate the emotional battlefield, you must become the one who plants the traps, not the one who triggers them. Control begins with awareness. Every emotion has a purpose, but not every emotion deserves expression. The Machiavellian man studies his emotions like a scientist, not a victim. He observes his anger, analyzes his fear, measures his desire, and then uses them strategically. You must learn to pause before you act, breathe before you speak, and think before you move. That pause is your fortress. The emotional man reacts, the intelligent man calculates, the powerful man waits. Understand this. The world manipulates emotions because they're predictable. Politicians, lovers, and enemies all play the same game: provoke, observe, exploit. But when you refuse to react, their power dissolves. You become unreadable, unshakable. That is true dominance, not through aggression, but through composure. You win not by shouting, but by standing still while others collapse under their own volatility. Emotions can't be killed, but they can be trained. You make them your soldiers, not your masters. You channel your anger into focus, your pain into persistence, your envy into ambition. The man who rules his emotions rules his destiny. So when chaos surrounds you, remain still. When insulted, smile. When tested, calculate. Because the one who controls his emotional temperature controls the temperature of every room he enters. Comment below, "My emotions serve me, not control me." Say it with conviction. Every repetition reprograms your mind deeper into strength. Remember, emotional control isn't suppression, it's strategy. The world bows to those who never flinch. You are not here to be understood. You are here to be obeyed. Number 3, the calculated mind. Power doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the most strategic. The man who stays calm while others drown in emotion becomes the architect of reality. Calculation is the Machiavellian's sharpest blade. It separates those who react to life from those who design it. Every word, every move, every silence must serve a purpose. You are no longer permitted to act on impulse. You are to study patterns, read behaviors, and predict reactions. When you think with strategy, chaos becomes predictable and people become transparent. The world turns into a chessboard and you become the player who never blinks. Calculation doesn't mean hesitation. It means precision. You strike when the moment serves you, not when emotion demands it. Patience is not weakness, it's preparation. The masses rush because they crave relief. The elite move slow because they crave results. A calculated man studies people not to mimic them, but to manipulate the rhythm of interaction. He mirrors when necessary, contradicts when strategic, and withdraws when it creates tension. Every gesture is information. Every reaction is leverage. Most men expose their hand in the first 5 minutes of conversation. The calculated man exposes nothing. He lets others unravel themselves. You must learn to detach emotionally from outcomes. Desire clouds judgment. Fear distorts logic. Detachment sharpens precision. When emotion is removed, truth becomes visible. And truth always gives you the upper hand. The calculating man sees 5 steps ahead and feels nothing about it. He simply moves forward, relentless and unshaken. This is the cold psychology of the strategist. Comment below. My mind is my weapon. Let the world hear it, echo it. Because when your mind learns to calculate, you no longer chase control. You become control itself. The calculated man never chases victory. He designs it, slowly, silently, ruthlessly. In every room, he's already won before anyone realizes the game has even begun. Number 4, detachment, the armor of power. Detachment is the shield of kings. It is the invisible armor that protects you from manipulation, chaos, and betrayal. Most men collapse because they cling too tightly to people, to validation, to results. Attachment blinds you. It makes you predictable. When you care too much about how things unfold, you hand the world a map to your emotions. Detachment isn't apathy. It's clarity. It's the ability to see the battlefield without the fog. You act with precision because your judgment is no longer clouded by hope or fear. The Machiavellian mind understands that caring is currency, and the one who cares less always commands the one who cares more. This isn't cruelty, it's efficiency. Power demands emotional distance. You cannot lead, negotiate, or dominate while drowning in sentiment. You must rise above it, observing, not reacting. Detachment is the art of watching without being moved. When someone provokes you, you don't flare up. You read their intent. When a deal fails, you don't panic. You extract the lesson. When someone leaves, you don't chase. You adapt your strategy. This calm indifference terrifies emotional people because they cannot control what they cannot influence. The detached man is dangerous because he is free. You can't blackmail a man detached from approval. You can't threaten a man detached from loss. He moves like smoke, untouchable, unbothered, unstoppable. Train yourself to treat emotion as data, not identity. When something triggers you, dissect it. Ask, why does this bother me? Then strip away the ego from your answer. Detachment gives you that power to feel everything yet be owned by nothing. Understand this. Emotional detachment isn't the absence of passion. It's the discipline to direct passion with accuracy. It's the difference between fire that destroys and fire that forges. Choose to forge. Choose to channel your energy toward what serves your long-term purpose, not your temporary feelings. Comment below. I feel everything, but nothing controls me. Let that truth burn deep into your subconscious. Because once you master detachment, betrayal, chaos, and manipulation stop hurting you, they start serving you. That's when you stop playing the game and start owning it. Number 5, emotional alchemy, turning pain into power. Pain is the raw material of transformation, but only the rare few know how to refine it. The weak drown in pain, the average numb it. The Machiavellian mind, he wields it. Pain is not your enemy, it's your forge. Every betrayal, every failure, every humiliation is data etched into your mind. You're meant to extract wisdom, not wounds. Emotional alchemy is the process of transforming suffering into strength, despair into drive, rejection into redirection. The world worships comfort, but comfort breeds weakness, and weakness kills ambition. To master emotional alchemy, stop asking, why did this happen to me? And start asking, how can I weaponize this? That question separates rulers from the ruled. Pain is information. It exposes where you're fragile, where your ego bleeds, where your identity still depends on approval. The Machiavellian man doesn't run from pain. He studies it with cold precision. He lets it burn away illusion until only truth remains. Your emotions are not obstacles, they are instruments. Anger can be fuel. Sadness can be focus. Betrayal can be liberation. When you redirect emotion into strategy, you become unstoppable. Emotional alchemy demands that you stop reacting to pain and start refining it, like a craftsman shaping steel. When life hits you, don't flinch. Observe, don't resist, adapt, don't pity yourself, plan. Every hardship is a test of emotional discipline. Those who react impulsively destroy themselves. Those who respond intelligently rise sharper, colder, and more strategic. The man who turns pain into power becomes indestructible because nothing external can penetrate his core. He has built himself from the stones others threw at him. This is dark psychology in its purest form, transforming adversity into superiority while others break under emotion. You crystallize into precision. Comment below. My pain is my power. Write it like an oath, because once you accept pain as your teacher, nothing can defeat you. Not loss, not failure, not betrayal. You become the alchemist of your fate, the commander of your emotions, the master of your mind. Power isn't found in avoiding suffering. It's found in sculpting it into strength. Every time you endure and evolve, you become less human, more force. Remember, steel is born in fire. Let your pain burn you into something unbreakable. Number 6, the psychology of cold power. Cold power is domination without volume, influence without pressure, destruction of illusion without emotion. It is silent, unnerving authority that comes not from strength or validation, but from total self-command. The man of cold power does not react. He observes, calculates, and dictates the terms of engagement. His calmness is not weakness, it's control. His silence is not hesitation, it's calculation. He doesn't chase, he attracts. He doesn't argue, he defines reality. This is the psychology of those who rule, not by fear, but by precision. The world confuses coldness with cruelty, but in truth, coldness is clarity. When emotion is stripped away from action, you see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. That vision gives you the edge. Most people drown in emotional noise. They need to feel powerful just to act powerful. But cold power doesn't need to feel. it simply exists. The Machiavellian mind knows that control is perception. People respect only what they can't predict or manipulate. When you master stillness, your presence becomes magnetic, your words heavier, your gaze commanding. Every movement becomes deliberate, every silence calculated. That is true psychological dominance, making others question themselves while you remain unshaken. Cold power never reacts to provocation. It observes, archives, and turns it into leverage later. You don't let anger steer you, you convert it into strategy. You don't let praise inflate you, you dissect the motive behind it. Learn to watch people like a chessboard. Everyone is playing a role. Some crave validation, others crave control, most crave distraction. Your task is to remain detached, to play your part with awareness, not attachment. The emotional man is transparent. The cold man is a mystery. People can't decide if you're ally or adversary, and that uncertainty becomes your weapon. This isn't about being heartless. It's about being disciplined enough to separate emotion from execution. When you make decisions unclouded by feeling, you become dangerous because no one can exploit your motives. You begin to see manipulation in real time, flattery, guilt, urgency, pity, and you stay unmoved. That is the essence of cold power, walking through emotional traps untouched. You don't fight emotion with emotion. You neutralize it with logic and distance. You let others think they've won while you quietly shape the outcome. Cold power thrives in patience, the ability to wait without anxiety. The powerful man knows that timing often outweighs action. He knows when to appear, when to disappear, when to strike, and when to observe. He never reveals plans, only results. He doesn't beg for loyalty. He earns it through presence. This isn't arrogance, it's alignment. Every move must project calm certainty, not reactive noise. When people sense your emotional stability, they begin to orbit around you. Stability is rare. Predictability is power. Cold power is the final form of control, the union of stoicism and strategy. You remain unmoved by chaos, untouched by praise, unfazed by opposition, grounded, deliberate, unreadable. The world tries to provoke emotion to control your focus. But once you stop responding to noise, noise stops owning you. Remember, indifference is the ultimate weapon. When you can face chaos and remain composed, you've already conquered it. The cold man doesn't compete. He observes, adapts, and silently takes over. He doesn't need to be seen. His results make him undeniable. Comment below. My calm is my control. Let that truth define you, because the calm man commands the storm. People fear what they can't emotionally sway, and that is your advantage. Cold power isn't about aggression. It's about presence, posture, and poise. It's the discipline to let others expose their weakness while you maintain your strength. You don't shout. You don't beg. You don't explain. You act, and your silence speaks louder than emotion ever could. Master cold power, and you'll never need to ask for respect. Your stillness will demand it. Number 7, the Machiavellian command, control without force. True control is never achieved through brute strength. It's born from invisible influence, subtle manipulation, and psychological precision. The Machiavellian command is the ability to shape outcomes without revealing your hand. It's the art of steering emotion, decision, and loyalty while appearing neutral. This is control without force, and it begins in the mind. Most men seek obedience through fear or authority. But fear fades, and authority can be challenged. Influence, however, true influence, seeps into the subconscious and directs behavior from within. The Machiavellian man doesn't demand, he engineers. He knows people obey not the loudest, but the one who speaks to their desires. He studies what drives them, validation, greed, love, recognition, and turns those drives into tools. To master others, you must master motives. To control someone, you don't oppose their nature, you guide it. You make them believe your will is their choice. That is ultimate control, when obedience feels like freedom. The Machiavellian command requires patience, awareness, and detachment. You must read what is unsaid. The twitch in the eye, the pause before a lie, the flicker of insecurity. Every word spoken is a window into the mind. And when you can read minds, you can lead them without resistance. The key is to conceal your intent. People resist control, but crave understanding. So understand them deeply, and they will follow you willingly. Influence begins with perception. People will see in you what you project. Project certainty, and they'll trust your direction. Project mystery, and they'll seek your approval. If you project calm authority, people will instinctively yield. That's dark psychology. Control through energy, not words. A Machiavellian doesn't argue. He defines the frame. He doesn't wrestle for control. He constructs the conditions so that control becomes inevitable. When you understand what people crave, you pull the strings. A loyal friend can be steered by gratitude. An ambitious rival can be maneuvered by ego. An insecure enemy can be crushed by silence. Control is never linear. It's emotional architecture. You must master when to reward, when to retreat, when to vanish. Your absence, when timed with precision, can command more power than your presence. This is how kings move, not by shouting, but by aligning incentives. People will betray their morals if you make them think they're achieving their desires. Remember, manipulation isn't always evil. Sometimes it's survival. Civilization itself is built on the manipulation of chaos into order. To control without force, never let anyone see you lose your calm. The second you react emotionally, your center is exposed. Always remain composed, observant, and analytical. When someone tries to provoke you, don't react. Study them. Their reaction becomes a roadmap to their weaknesses. Because once you know what ignites a person, you own their strings. Comment below, I control by staying calm. Let that be your creed. Because control without composure is illusion. The Machiavellian command is cold, still, and precise. You don't prove dominance. You radiate it. Every word, every look, every silence becomes part of your design. Power doesn't announce itself, it's felt. The real leader isn't the loudest. He's the one whose influence remains when he's gone. When you enter a room, never chase attention. Make it chase you. When you speak, speak slowly. When you move, move deliberately. When you decide, decide with certainty. These are the markers of command. The man who stays composed while others burn decides the fate of the fire. Influence the emotions of others, but never let them touch yours. This is control without force, the quiet strength that bends the world without ever seeming to touch it. Number 8. The shadow of influence. The power of perception. Perception is the currency of power, and those who control it control reality. The Machiavellian man knows truth doesn't matter if people believe something else. Power isn't about what's real, it's about what's believed to be real. You could be wise, strong, and disciplined, but if the world sees weakness, it will treat you as such. Yet if you project calm, control, and confidence, even in uncertainty, the world bows to that illusion. Humans don't respond to logic, they respond to signals. Every tone, glance, and gesture either amplifies or weakens your dominance. The art of perception lies in managing impressions intentionally, not by accident. Most men are too exposed, revealing their emotions, fears, and ambitions, thinking authenticity earns respect. But authenticity without restraint is self-destruction. You must choose which parts of yourself the world deserves to see and what remains behind the mask. A Machiavellian doesn't fake, he curates. That's not deception, it's defense. Transparency invites danger, and vulnerability is leverage in the wrong hands. The man who understands perception plays life like theater. Every room becomes his stage, every person his audience, every movement a calculated act. When you master your image, you control how others interpret your words, your silence, and your absence. You become a mystery, and mystery commands respect. People fear what they can't predict and trust what they can't fully grasp. Appear confident but never desperate, intelligent but never arrogant, detached but never lifeless. Balance is your armor. Influence is not about forcing thoughts. It's about crafting conditions where people choose your truth on their own. The shadow of influence lingers quietly, long after you've left. That's how real power operates. Silently, strategically, relentlessly. Remember, reputation is worth more than truth. Guard it, shape it, weaponize it. When you walk, move with purpose. When you speak, let every word carry gravity. When you listen, make others feel seen. When you smile, let it be rare. Rarity increases worth. Never let anyone predict your next move. Predictability kills mystique. Even kindness should feel intentional, never impulsive. The world watches more than it listens, and in that observation, they define your value. Project inevitability, that unshakable sense that no matter what happens, you stay composed, untouched, in command. People trust the image of strength more than strength itself. Your mission is to embody that illusion until it becomes indistinguishable from truth. Comment below, I am the perception they fear. Let that embed in your mind. Because when perception bends around you, reality follows. The man who controls how others see him controls how they act, how they think, and how they respond. That is psychological dominance in its purest form. Shaping emotion through suggestion, guiding thought without demand, steering fate without force. The shadow of influence doesn't scream, it whispers. It moves unseen, yet it's always felt. Silent but heavy. And when you master that, you stop chasing power. Power starts chasing you. Number 9, the discipline of control, the war within. The greatest battle isn't fought against others, it's waged inside your own mind. Emotional control isn't about suppression, it's about command. Your emotions are soldiers. They should serve your will, not sabotage it. Every man who seeks power must first conquer himself. The undisciplined man is his own downfall. His impulses betray him before his enemies ever get the chance. Discipline separates chaos from command, noise from precision. You must train your mind to obey under pressure. When emotions rise, you remain unshaken. When temptation whispers, you stay deaf. You stand still, anchored in logic, unbothered by distraction. The Machiavellian mind knows discipline is freedom. The freedom to act with intent instead of instinct. Each moment you resist impulse, you sharpen your control. Each time you delay gratification, you harden your will. The world is filled with men enslaved by feelings, chasing lust, greed, and validation. They live reactively, like puppets to their emotions. But you, the disciplined one, cut the strings and move with design. You don't crave comfort, you crave control. You rise early, not because you must, but because you command yourself to. You train your body because the body follows the orders of the mind. You learn to endure quietly, because real strength doesn't speak, it endures. Discipline isn't punishment, it's power. When you command yourself, no one else can. The Machiavellian man treats emotions as instruments, useful when played, silent when not. He doesn't feel anger, he uses it. He doesn't fear, he prepares. He doesn't seek approval, he extracts growth from rejection. Discipline creates distance from chaos. You stop taking things personally because you understand. Emotional reactions are traps. The disciplined man is unreadable. His tone steady, his movements minimal, his gaze calculating. You can't provoke him, you can't manipulate him. You can't destroy him because he's already destroyed his weaker self. The war within never ends, but each victory expands your dominion. Self-control isn't an act, it's an identity. It's the line dividing leaders from followers, predators from prey, kings from jesters. Comment below, I conquer myself daily. That is mastery. The enemy outside only wins when the enemy inside is undisciplined. You don't need to dominate the world. You need to master your reactions, and the world will fall in line. The man who commands emotion becomes a fortress, silent, respected, untouchable. His calm silences the loud, his patience dismantles the reckless, his stillness outlasts the arrogant. Discipline isn't glamorous, it's cold, consistent, absolute. But it's the foundation of power that never fades. Control your urges, direct your emotions, refine your reactions, and you will reign where others kneel. Number 10, the untouchable mind, ascending beyond emotion. To be untouchable, You must rise above emotion, not by avoiding it, but by mastering it so completely that it no longer owns you. The untouchable mind is the final form of the Machiavellian spirit, calm in chaos, unbroken in betrayal, clear amid destruction. Life will always test you, through manipulation, temptation, loss, and deceit. But your response defines your dominance. The man who reacts gives away power. The man who responds controls the field. To be untouchable is to realize nothing external belongs to you. Not money, not love, not reputation. Only your inner state is yours. Guard it like a kingdom. Every insult, every failure, every storm is a lesson in composure. You stop seeking validation and revenge and start moving like a strategist. Your mind becomes your empire, every thought a loyal soldier to your will. The untouchable man doesn't prove power. He embodies it, quiet, precise, unmoved. He walks like a ghost of control, untouched by the chaos of lesser men. To reach this level, abandon the need to be liked or understood. Become comfortable being misunderstood, even feared, because greatness cannot coexist with comfort. True power isolates, and in that solitude, you find clarity. You see people not as foes or friends, but as pieces of a grander plan. You stop chasing outcomes. You attract alignment. You stop searching for peace. You become it. Comment below, I am untouchable. Let it be your declaration of psychological sovereignty. Because when you see emotions as passing storms, you stop building homes inside them, and instead build fortresses above them. The untouchable mind is forged in pain, sharpened by discipline, sustained by purpose. Every trial makes you colder, sharper, calmer, until nothing breaks your stillness. You become the eye of the storm, silent, centered, unstoppable. And when the world realizes it can't move you, it will have no choice but to respect you. Remember, never react, respond. Never chase, attract. Never explain, demonstrate. You are now Machiavellian, and therefore you are free. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because power belongs to those who stay in control.